SpaceWatch, I was focused on looking at different health outcomes among people in populations living with HIV. And ultimately, we kept seeing the same thing. We were controlling for all of these other variables like access to healthcare, distance to clinic, the type of medication people were receiving, and all sorts of other behaviors and moods and attitudes. And ultimately, it was if you lived in a poorer neighborhood, you had worse outcomes. And so I said, I guess I need to understand more what it is, the structure of the neighborhood that really guides how we live.
Hey, SpaceWatchers, this is Space Café Radio, your channel about trends, awesome events, and interesting people in this space sector. HIV research and GEOINT. How is that connected? One of many questions I asked Dr. Enbal Shacham, Professor and Associate Dean at St. Louis University's College for Public Health and Social Justice. We talked about her groundbreaking work in GEOINT and public health to redefine how we address complex global issues. Enbal emphasizes the importance of interdisciplinary training and teamwork in the field, reflecting on her role in the USGIF Board of Directors and efforts to attract and educate the next generation of GEOINT professionals. She envisions the future of GEOINT is streamlined, multi-sensor, real-time and open access, addressing complex global challenges like climate change and political instability in this very intense podcast. This Space Café Radio is co-produced and supported by USGIF. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. Lean back and enjoy this episode. Hey SpaceWatchers, and welcome from the USGIF GEOINT Symposium 2024. Enbal, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
Can you help me with one thing that I learned here, or try to understand? What is GEOINT? Can you give us and our listeners a definition we can work with?
I will give you a working definition. How about that? The one that makes sense to me is taking geospatial science or data and having it guide intelligence decisions. And in the world that I live in, I think GEOINT is just combining those two together and thinking through how do we better inform location-based decisions.
What is it?
It's data information.
And data from everywhere. Social data, satellite imagery, drone data, whatever it is.
From the ground to the space, everything in between.
From seabed to space. That's what I learned here as well.
They really use that language often, and it makes sense because we have data available from the seabed to space in ways that we didn't always have available to us before. And now we're able to make decisions or know more based on those information. Those data guide decisions for intelligence community members, but also for emergency response, for health communication and needs. We're able to use these data in ways that are non-traditional outside of the intelligence field, but also really guiding the intelligence community decisions. Everything happens somewhere. And that's why the geospatial anchor is saying this is a location-based data source and data point.
And I think what is hard on a podcast is to explain that this kind of data, it's not just the image we see.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about satellite imagery or Earth observation, then we have a picture in mind, a visual representation of the environment in true color when we talk about electro-optical images or cell data or hyperspectral, or you name it. So GEOINT is more. It is more than this image. It's the information we see interpreted. Is that correct?
Yes, I think one of the challenges from when I came into this space, not literally, but when I came into this field, I didn't understand how to use those images for the work and interest that I have in research around health. But I've been able to grow my research in that area. But one of the things that I had been thinking about is how we've grown. Our technology has grown so quickly. Everyone carrying a smartphone has that geospatial data. We're tracking where you are. We understand those sensors in ways that I don't know that they were intentional when they developed this technology. Yet today we are able to identify where there are different types of mobility, and we call that geomobility throughout a community, or what other political instability may be occurring. Where are people congregating? How are they moving around their communities? And we're able to respond to those needs in different ways. So that's one piece that you can't see it, but those are the social sensing data that we use too.
It scared me a bit when you said we track you with your mobile. It feels not that safe.
So companies are tracking you, right? So,
that doesn't make it better.
No. So in my perspective, you're giving your data away for advertising, selling more products. And in my way, I want to say, I want to use your data for good. So I look at those patterns as, how can I help you make better choices in your daily life? Right. So for health, and this isn't really GEOINT in the primary sense, but I think in my perspective, I look at where you move and how you live, work, and play really is guided by where you are. And so those movements then give me an opportunity to help you. Hey, last time you went into this bar, you drank 8 drinks. How about today you try to only drink 5 or 3? Could you imagine that geofenced opportunity to help you make better decisions or remind you to go home? You've had enough to drink.
Okay,
for example.
Let's come to that a bit later.
Okay. It's all connected in my mind.
Yeah. What dragged you into this industry, into this sector?
I don't think it was dragged.
What brought you into the sector? It was one of the many opportunities in life, I'm quite sure.
It was. All my research findings were pointing to the same thing. We were identifying that I was in HIV research. I was focused on looking at different health outcomes among people and populations living with HIV. And ultimately, we kept seeing the same thing. We were controlling for all of these other variables like access to healthcare, distance to clinic, the type of medication people were receiving, and all sorts of other behaviors and moods and attitudes. And ultimately, it was if you lived in a poorer neighborhood, you had worse outcomes. And so I said, I guess I need to understand more what it is, the structure of the neighborhood that really guides how we live. We knew this before, but it's hard to unpack. And so often our research continues to say, oh, access to healthcare is the problem. But when you give people access to healthcare, that challenge continues to persist. So in my daily life, I have a lot of stressors. I could have them throughout my day. When I have more resources, I have fewer stressors. Right? Or I have fewer stressor that I'm able to overcome, or maybe I'm able to overcome more of those stressors without much challenges. Ultimately, what I'm seeing then, I was uncovering all this whole other world of GEOINT. And that's when I jumped into this field and said, this is really interesting. And I was working with colleagues who we were understanding political instability and what drives political instability. And that food and water insecurity is driving lots of the political instability in addition to religion, ultimately. But what we're trying to identify is these patterns. How do we reduce unrest? How do we reduce food insecurities and water insecurity to make people's lives more stable? And that stability is all driven by intelligence in many ways. That's how I got in here.
Okay.
My curiosity for that.
I try to understand how GEOINT and health field you work with, and you pointed to HIV, so goes together. Can you give us some more examples?
I came into HIV because it's a perfect example of an inequity. So what I look at things that aren't fair. And I get really interested in figuring out what are the policy levers that can change outcomes, whether that's more stability, whether that's more water and food security, or better opportunities for education and employment. In the United States, there's a lot of income inequality and inequity. So how are these decisions being made? They were ultimately policy decisions. And so that's how I started going down this path. It was an example. It's a horrible infection that is driven by this inequity. People are engaging in this behavior over here and that behavior over there, yet only certain people are getting infected. And that wasn't fair. And so when I started an HIV infection, it was that pattern of understanding the people who were getting infected, the people who had access to healthcare, and the people who were able to manage their HIV better is different on each one of those points. And so what are the next steps? Can I go upstream further and create insights for how do we create healthy environments for more people to flourish? And I think that GEOINT is really what we're doing. And am I the example of what geospatial intelligence would turn around and say, Enbal Shacham, she's the epitome of what we consider as a key partner in the GEOINT community? Maybe. But the other part of that is I can look at the application of it in many different ways. So I hope they keep me around for that.
When you talked about HIV, that sounds a bit something from the 80s when it broke out. Is that still a subject of research? Or
Yes.
Honestly, okay.
Yes. We have not solved this problem anywhere in the world. So the problems of HIV and inequity and access to healthcare, we have advanced HIV infection medications and the medical advancements for prevention and treatment get us to a place that if we had this for cancer, we would have said we have cured it. But we are nowhere near curing HIV. We had 2 cases right now, I think, that for HIV, this isn't the topic, but where the person is no longer testing for positive for HIV. But ultimately, if we adhere to our medications and have people adhere to their medications, they're not transmitting HIV and they're also living as long a life as an uninfected person. So that's tremendous. And we are not at a place where this no longer is a problem. It is wild to me that we're not there, but it is consistently not solved.
I think I'm just representing a very common perception that we think we have cured it and it's not there anymore. Thanks for this clarification. We're here at the USGIF symposium and you're a USGIF member. What are you doing at the foundation?
So I am a USGIF member and I'm also a member of the board of directors. So I began being on the board of directors last June, and I'll be able to be on for 3 years. It's a 3-year term. I am right now really the education representative on the board of directors. And so in that role, I think about the opportunities to help academic institutions and non-traditional training programs stand up and think about how to encourage GEOINT training. What are the types of training that we need to consider? Working with industry partners to identify and government partners to identify what are the skill sets our graduates need to have or the people they want to hire. I think about how to organize some of that a little bit better. We have through USGIF, they have a training program. I'm in St. Louis University and in St. Louis, Missouri, which is in the middle of the country. What do we do there? We have different training programs. We have a collaborative group of people at different universities or training institutions that have worked together to grow some of these, we call them talent pipelines, right? So how can we make sure that the right people get hired with the right skills and matching those? That's my responsibility that I've taken on as a member of the board of directors.
And how do you attract the next generation for this sector? What is a persona you look for in this sector?
So it depends who you ask. I think that's truly, it depends who you ask. And the worry...
That is something what I recognized here. You ask the same question to different people, you get multiple answers.
So I think in the U.S. there's been a shift in some of the education and training, and it's really focused on STEM or sometimes STEAM. So thinking about those core science training programs. One of the challenges with that is that we're left with not understanding political science, history, cultural context, demography, and really how things shift in communities across the world. Right. So that instability is siloed when you're training somebody to learn how to code or how to analyze or collect and analyze satellite imagery. So I think either we continue to train students or early professionals or children to think about how do you work on a team. We don't do that very well, but thinking about that team, not just team science, but team practice, right? How do we all bring something to the table and answer a bigger question? And also, how do we help train future professionals to think about these complex problems we have today and in the future?
What has to be done now, talking about activities on the education side to get these young people into the sector? So building up on the last question, because we are not talking about a void where people have the choice to go to GEOINT or nothing. No, we are competing with very cool other industries, without naming them. But there's a world outside GEOINT, that It's hard to believe, but
it's hard to believe here.
It is. Yeah. So how do I get people into the sector?
I've always said the work that I'm doing is so exciting to me. There's so many complex problems, and it didn't matter which part of my career I've been focused on. So complex problems are interesting and intriguing to me to figure out how do we unpack them. The siloed approach to training ends up leaving people not ready to respond to big problems. Our systems are actually siloed as well. So if we're not talking about understanding how space works outside of the field of food security, right? So thinking about these really strange, unexpected partners in these spaces, right? So how do we help? I think an intriguing way to get people involved in this space, or I'm hoping that it is saying these are big, complex problems, and you're going to work with a team of people, and I'm going to train you on all of these different pieces. So you can have depth on one piece, but you'll also understand you are responsible for understanding the history and the political nature of and the cultural context of where you're doing that work. I know in the US, we've really shifted away from some of that, and that makes people not as excited to work on this type of problem.
Is the work of an analyst and GEOINT specialist team focused today?
Sometimes. It depends where you're working. So I think my colleagues and some of who are analysts in looking at imagery, they're learning how machines are going to help their work. So they're learning that in real time. The good news is their jobs are going to be streamlined in a way that is not going to be as onerous, as exhausting in many ways to assess and analyze imagery. A computer will do that for you, and you will make sure it's accurate. I think the biases that we all introduce anytime we code, anytime we figure out an algorithm, that's forever going to be a problem until the next generation figures out how to fix this. Because we're human, right? So we come in, we've created our lives. We have biases and categories of how we live. So once we are able to identify those, we have to know this now for imagery. We have to know this for what we assume people, when we think about anonymized smartphone data and where people are going and what they're doing at those places. I have a bias of what I assume people are doing, and then I have to think, okay, back out, and who else can analyze this pattern? Those patterns are really important. We need to understand that from a diverse viewpoint.
Let's talk about AI as your friend. So how will AI change the analyst work? Do we still need in the future a human? Will we need still a human in the loop in the future?
I don't foresee a time where we won't need humans for the work that we're talking about. The decisions that are made on some of these algorithms really need human eyeballs on them to make sure they're correct. And it should streamline and speed up the process. We need real-time, accurate data to respond to real-time challenges on the ground.
You said we need a human to take this decision, to take its eyeballs on it. But if you don't understand the algorithm, then you have to take a decision based on trust to the machine. Is the human in that instance just the one who is responsible for signing it off at the end? Because I can't make the machine responsible?
Definitely. But that's a challenging question because I don't think we have a plan for that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think in general, when we consider who's developing the algorithms, how they're tested, how they're implemented, someone has to evaluate them. And this is where a team, I think, is so necessary. That one analyst is never going to be responsible for all of that because that's irresponsible in my mind. If we have no other resource, then fine, but it doesn't seem like the best choice to rely on someone to develop, review, and implement and continue to review something. We don't usually do that in any other place if we think about that. In any other practice, we usually have somebody do some sort of evaluation and make sure that's the right person or the process is correct.
Describe for us the persona for GEOINT. What do they have to do? How does the job look like? We are advanced from just steering on a satellite imagery.
Yeah. We are. There are some people who are still staring at satellite imagery, and that is also a very important job, right? It's not the job for me, but there are some people who really enjoy that work. And there are the people who are building the algorithms and understanding computer vision and understanding how do we quickly identify these patterns and then say, okay, this is the algorithm we can develop. Say this is unusual in this image. we need to identify what that is. So we have those types of people. We have the imagery analyst, we have the algorithm maker, we have the evaluation person who says, okay, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. We also have the people who are cultural context makes sense and say, this does not make sense. When you're saying some of my work includes identifying camel caravans or herds and identifying where they are and how they move. So if someone on the ground can tell me, no, that's not culturally appropriate, or that's not geographically, contextually correct, you need to have that person for every piece of the analysis you need to include. And if you think about social sensing, so who's the chatter on social media? How do we identify those patterns of news stories or using different types of social media to discuss certain comments? You need the cultural anchor that gives a sense of, is this accurate? And when you understand things, are they true, or are you understanding them in a correct way?
What I'm learning is that there is not the one persona for GEOINT. You need the variety of life, as you mentioned, the diversity that we see in the day-to-day life. How is USGIF addressing the issue of education? We have seen here at the symposium, at the first day, the forward day, number of student groups coming in. There's this golden ticket initiative and so on. So there seems to be something, but what is that?
One of the greatest components of being a part of the USGIF, this foundation is focused on scholarships and mentorship programs that have grown tremendously in the last several years. And those opportunities allow students to be exposed to GEOINT-related fields. So some of them are, I know in one of our summer programs last year, it was related to thinking about fishing vessels that are not supposed to be there. So identifying how you can see this on imagery and then using other data layers to say, what does this mean? And ultimately, the students were exposed to something that they hadn't ever thought about before. Data that they hadn't ever considered as a point of resource, right? They didn't know any of this. And it's just exposing them to this type of work. The hiring managers may not think the same way as I do. The hiring managers still want an engineer, a data scientist, or remote sensor, right? We want all those satellite imagery analysts. We want those, but we want all of them to work together in my mind. And so to me, and I think the next generation is going to have to look like this is creative, this is meaningful, and this is multidisciplinary. I think it's a really cool field, but it's hard to sell, especially when you have other areas that look really cool and intriguing and interesting for young people today.
What is your advice to other organizations or other nations to get people into the GEOINT sector? Because I would say what I've seen here over the last days, the US is very advanced in that segment, with the various entities that are active in the GEOINT field. Just talking about the numbers, we have 4,000 attendees here, 450 are foreigners. And in my wording, I would say only 450 are foreigners. So there's a majority, obviously, Americans. So what is the advice for other nations to keep up in this sector?
Well, I think one of the important notes that I would highlight is that we, in practice, my partners and these leaders that I've been listening to for the last several days, they're working on the ground or in the air, responding to areas of conflict together with outside of just U.S. information. So the U.S., to use their words, the U.S. warfighter is not working by themselves. They're working with other nations. And so when we think about the other nations, how are they working together both on data and practice? And I think some of that conversation has been addressed here at GEOINT, but how do we make sure that we're sharing those data in real time so every one of our partners gets to see what the U.S. version of the warfighter is seeing so that decisions can be made jointly in real time? I think that the advancement of these data and sharing those data to advance the practice is important. We can't wait for several weeks when decisions have to be made on the ground. And when I hear that, I think about how are we sharing those data and how are we making sure our partners are participating hand in hand with us.
For that to keep up with the advanced technology, they need the people trained as well. We are back to the training.
It makes me think of, so I said multidisciplinary, but this cross-disciplinary work is cross-sector, cross-country, the opportunities to train together are endless. And I don't think we've been creative enough to respond to the actual needs of today and tomorrow. Climate and political instability are driving so much of what we're responding to all over the world. So those changes in climate need to be leading what we're thinking and doing, in addition to this response to political instability all over the world.
My final question to you, and I know it's an easy one, how will GEOINT look like in 10 years from now?
I don't think that's easy at all. I laughed when you suggested that I would know that. I think in my imagination, GEOINT will be far better streamlined. We will be able to use multi-sensors to provide an early sensing system that can tell you these are the different avenues of data, where they're coming from, and they're all anchored in location. So you can say this area of flooding or this area of water insecurity or food insecurity is driving political instability, right? So we can say we need some sort of information right here. I want those data sources in real time, open access, and that's just a dream. But it's not impossible. It's a great opportunity, I would say, to respond to the human needs across the world.
I do have to come up with another question, because finding out that, as you said, flooding, this area is in danger of flooding with the next upcoming whatever mega storm or so, that has a consequence. Having the data, having the proof, having the academic side is one end, but the consequence to execute something, to move people out of this area, to move people somewhere else, to get them sell their properties. These are major consequences. And I think we're just touching on these with the upcoming challenges humanity is looking into right now.
I do. I think we're not equipped to respond to those urgent needs. I think when I consider flooding, 10% of the world's population is within 10 meters of sea level. When you consider that, and we're not actively moving people away from those high-risk areas, it's the role of government in many ways. And that feels very big government. And as an American, that's especially big government. And who's going to pay? What you alluded to, we'd have to pay people for their homes. But who's going to pay when you know it's going to be underwater? For example, many of these homes, particularly in the United States, we've been paying for home insurance for generations. Where's that money? It's time to pay out, right? So we could think about who's been cashing in on this, to be blunt, and how do we get some of that circle back? This is time. This is an urgent need. We need to respond to human needs.
Do we have a chance to finish this podcast on a positive note?
Oh, shoot. Positive note. Hold on. I do think that when I'm urging the next generation to be cross-disciplinary, I'm urging the old generation, the people like me and older people than me, to work together. And we can be creative to solve these problems. I don't think that it's impossible, but I also don't think the solution is waiting for the flood to hit and then respond. That emergency response is not preparedness. I think there's a lot we know and a lot we can do. So the opportunities are endless. How about that? That's positive.
Thank you. Indeed. Dr. Enbal Shacham, thank you very much for your time and this wonderful podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.